The heavy, unrelenting rain felt like a fitting backdrop for the darkest day of my life. It drummed a hollow, rhythmic beat against the canopy of black umbrellas clustered around the freshly dug earth at Oakwood Memorial. The scent of damp soil mixed with the suffocating sweetness of hundreds of white lilies, David's favorite. As the polished mahogany casket carrying my husband was slowly lowered into the ground, a profound, numbing silence settled over my heart. David had been my rock, my sanctuary, the only person who had ever truly seen me, protected me, and loved me for exactly who I was. He was a brilliant architect, a man who built things to last, and for 10 years he had been the architect of my happiness. Now, at just 34 years old, an aggressive and unforgiving illness had taken him from me in mere months. I stood at the edge of the grave, the cold mud seeping into the soles of my black stilettos, my trembling hands clutching a single, bruised, white rose. I was entirely consumed by a grief so absolute, so suffocating, that it felt as though my lungs had been filled with lead. But even in the suffocating grip of my heartbreak, I could feel the venomous gaze of the two people standing just 10 feet away. My older siblings, Julian and Beatrice. They did not wear the expressions of grieving relatives. They did not carry the quiet, respectful sorrow of family members mourning the tragic loss of their brother-in-law. Instead, Julian stood tall in his perfectly tailored midnight blue Armani suit, his hair slicked back, a subtle, arrogant smirk playing on the corner of his lips. He checked his Rolex, a gaudy, diamond-encrusted monstrosity that he had bought to project a wealth he did not actually possess, every 3 minutes, as if this burial was nothing more than an inconvenient layover on his flight to somewhere more important. Beside him, Beatrice shifted restlessly. She was draped in an ostentatious black mink coat that was entirely inappropriate for a gloomy April afternoon, her face hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses. I watched from the corner of my eye as she leaned into Julian, whispering something behind a manicured hand. Julian let out a sharp, muted chuckle. A laugh. At my husband's grave. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing the anger down. Not today, I told myself. Do not let them taint David's final moment. But the true depths of their depravity would not be revealed until the wake. Following the burial, the mourners retreated to the sprawling, multi-million-dollar modern estate that David and I had built together in the exclusive hills of the city. The house, with its soaring 20-foot ceilings, floor-to-ceiling glass windows, and imported Italian marble floors, was a masterpiece. It was a testament to David's genius and my own quiet, hidden success in the tech industry. A success my family willfully ignored because it did not fit their narrative of me being the weak, pathetic little sister. As caterers in crisp white uniforms circulated silently with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and crystal flutes of champagne, I stood in the corner of the grand living room, accepting hollow condolences from distant relatives and David's colleagues. I was entirely emotionally drained, a ghost haunting my own home. I desperately needed a moment of silence. I excused myself from a conversation with one of David's old professors and slipped away from the crowded living room, making my way down the long, dimly lit corridor toward David's private study. It was a sanctuary of dark oak, leather-bound books, and the lingering, comforting scent of his cedarwood cologne. I just wanted to sit in his leather armchair. I just wanted to close my eyes and pretend he was still there. As I approached the heavy oak double doors of the study, I noticed they were slightly ajar. A sliver of warm light spilled out onto the hallway runner, and then I heard the voices. "The transfer is complete, Julian. Just confirm it on your end." It was Beatrice. Her voice was sharp, breathless, trembling with a disgusting cocktail of adrenaline and greed. "I see it. 2,000,000 cents. Julian replied, his voice thick with smug satisfaction. God, she is so entirely clueless. Sitting out there playing the weeping widow while we finally take what is rightfully ours. Father never should have left that trust to her in the first place. I stopped dead in my tracks. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. The $2 million. When our father passed away 2 years ago, he had deliberately bypassed my financially irresponsible, perpetually bankrupt siblings and left his entire liquid estate, a $2 million trust, in my name. He had made me the sole executor and beneficiary, knowing that Julian had gambled away his own startup funds and Beatrice was drowning in secret credit card debt to maintain her plastic country club lifestyle. The trust was locked behind complex legal parameters, requiring my physical signature and digital dual authentication to move, until today. I pushed the heavy oak door open. It swung silently on its hinges. Julian was sitting directly in David's chair, with my personal, unlocked iPad in his hands. Beatrice was hovering over his shoulder, holding a stack of legal documents and my husband's engraved Mont Blanc pen. They had forged my physical signature on the power of attorney documents I had foolishly left on the desk while dealing with funeral arrangements, and while I was standing in the pouring rain watching my husband's casket go into the ground, Julian had stolen my iPad from my purse, bypassed the passcode he had clearly shoulder-surfed, and authorized the final wire transfer of the entire $2 million trust into his and Beatrice's offshore joint account. They looked up as the door swung open. For a fraction of a second, panic flashed in Beatrice's heavily made-up eyes. But as she looked at me, standing there in my damp black dress, pale, exhausted, and utterly broken by grief, the panic instantly melted into a cruel, condescending smirk. "Oh, Elena, you're hovering," Beatrice said, casually tossing the forged power of attorney documents into her designer tote bag. She took a slow, deliberate sip from a crystal tumbler of David's most expensive vintage scotch. "You really should be out there with your guests. It's rude to hide." "What did you just do?" My voice was incredibly quiet. It didn't shake. It was a flat, terrifying monotone. Julian stood up, straightening his tie with an air of absolute superiority. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from me, looking down his nose. "We are doing you a favor, little sister," Julian said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy and dripping malice. "You are clearly completely unhinged right now. The grief is blinding you. Father's money is not safe in the hands of an emotionally unstable widow. You have no husband to manage your affairs anymore. We are simply stepping in to protect the family assets. You should be thanking us." "You stole $2 million, I said, my eyes locking dead onto his. "While I was burying my husband. You sat in his chair and you stole my inheritance." Beatrice laughed, a loud, sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Oh, grow up, Elena. It was never your money. Father was senile when he wrote that will. We are the older siblings. We are the faces of this family. You are just a quiet little nobody who got lucky by marrying a man who built a nice house. And now he's gone. What are you going to do with $2 million? Buy more black dresses?" She stepped closer, poking a long acrylic fingernail into my shoulder. "Go back out there. Cry for your dead husband. Play the victim like you always do. If you make a scene, if you try to call the police, we will tell everyone you are having a psychotic break from the grief. We have the signed documents. It's done. The money is gone. Now be a good little girl, pick up a tissue, and get out of our way." Julian smirked, tossing my iPad onto the leather sofa like a piece of trash. He grabbed his coat, wrapped an arm around Beatrice, and they walked right past me, their shoulders brushing aggressively against mine as they exited the study, leaving the scent of cheap perfume and expensive scotch in their wake. They expected me to collapse. They expected me to fall to my knees, to scream, to weep, to beg them to give it back. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a fragile, pathetic doormat, completely oblivious to the ironclad empire I had been quietly building behind the scenes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even blink. I calmly walked over to the desk, picked up my iPad, and opened the banking application. The balance of the trust account read $0. I looked at the empty screen, and in the quiet, absolute silence of my dead husband's study, a terrifying, beautiful clarity washed over me. The grief that had been paralyzing me just moments ago was instantly incinerated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and ruthlessly violent fire. They thought they had just secured their futures. They thought they had finally put the pathetic younger sister in her place. They had no idea that they had just signed their own financial death warrants. They did not know that the quiet little nobody had recently acquired the very holding company that owned the debt on Julian's failing business, or that the private equity firm I secretly founded owned the mortgage on Beatrice's heavily leveraged mansion. They stole my money at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. By 3 p.m. on Wednesday, I was going to ensure that neither of them would ever have a single penny to their names ever again. Let's freeze the frame right there. I want you to hold that exact, horrifying image in your mind for just a moment. I want you to picture the heavy, oppressive silence of my late husband's mahogany study. I want you to visualize the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lingering scent of cheap, overpowering perfume mixed with the sharp bite of expensive, stolen scotch. I want you to picture my brother's smug, arrogant smile as he casually discarded my personal property like it was garbage. I want you to see the glaring, digital numbers on that glowing iPad screen, shining like a neon sign in the dim light, screaming the ultimate betrayal. $0. $2 million. Gone in the span of a 15-minute funeral reception. Stolen by the very people who shared my blood, while the man I loved more than breathing was literally being lowered into the cold, wet earth. Before I tell you how the hammer of absolute, unyielding justice fell upon Julian and Beatrice, before I take you step by step through the meticulous, cold-blooded, and entirely legal financial execution I rained down upon my arrogant siblings, stripping them of their homes, their fake status, and their unearned pride in less than 24 hours, I need to pause this story. I need to step out of that dark, suffocating room, look straight through the lens of this camera, and speak directly to you. Yes, you. The person sitting behind the screen right now, listening to the cadence of my voice. Before we move forward into the absolute destruction of my family's toxic empire, I want you to go down into the comments section of this video right now. I want you to tell me exactly where in the world you are watching this from. Are you sitting in a quiet apartment in Chicago? Are you watching from a bustling coffee shop in London? Are you tuning in from a small town in Texas, a high-rise in Tokyo, or a suburb in Melbourne? Type your city and your country in the comments below. I ask this because the disease of toxic, narcissistic family members knows no geographic boundaries. It does not care about your zip code, your tax bracket, your culture, or your language. The pain of family betrayal is a universal language, and I want to see just how massive and global our community of survivors truly is. Once you've dropped your location in the comments, I need you to do something else. I need you to hit that like button. Do not just tap it. Hit it with intention. And then I need you to hit the subscribe button and turn on every single notification. I want you to hit subscribe if you have ever, even once in your entire life, been forced to swallow your pride, bite your tongue, and endure the suffocating, soul-crushing weight of a toxic family member's abuse. Hit the like button if you know the bone-deep, exhausting reality of being the designated scapegoat in your family. Subscribe to this channel if you have ever sat at a Thanksgiving dinner table, a wedding, a birthday party, or a funeral, and watched a useless, entitled, and entirely incompetent golden child be praised, pampered, and funded, while your own massive achievements, your hard work, and your quiet struggles were completely ignored or blatantly mocked. Hit that like button if you have ever had your boundaries trampled on by people who weaponized the phrase, "but we're family," to excuse their absolutely unforgivable behavior. If you have ever been treated as nothing more than an emotional punching bag, an unpaid therapist, or an endless blank check ATM for parents or siblings who refuse to take accountability for their own disastrous life choices, then this video, this story, and this channel were made specifically for you. We need to have a very raw, very honest conversation about what just happened in that study, because I know that my story is not an isolated incident. I know that millions of you listening right now have felt the exact same freezing ice in your veins that I felt when I looked at that $0 bank balance. Society conditions us from the moment we take our first breath to believe that family is a sacred, unbreakable bond. We are fed this fairy tale that blood is thicker than water, that your siblings are your built-in best friends, and that your parents are your ultimate protectors. We are brainwashed by movies, television shows, and societal guilt trips to believe that no matter how horribly a family member treats you, you must always forgive them. You must always turn the other cheek. You must always keep the peace. Don't make a scene, they say. Be the bigger person, they demand. But what society absolutely refuses to acknowledge is that sometimes the most dangerous, venomous, and destructive people in your entire life are the ones who share your DNA. Sometimes the predators aren't hiding in the dark alleys. They are sitting across from you at the dining room table, passing the mashed potatoes, and smiling for the Christmas card photo. Let's dissect the psychology of what Julian and Beatrice did. What you witnessed in that study was not just theft. It was a masterclass in narcissistic entitlement and weaponized grief. Toxic family members possess a terrifying, almost predatory sixth sense for vulnerability. They do not look at your moments of profound tragedy, a divorce, a job loss, a devastating medical diagnosis, or, in my case, the tragic, untimely death of a spouse, with empathy or compassion. They do not see a human being in agonizing pain. They see a chink in your armor. They see an opportunity. When my husband David died, Julian and Beatrice didn't see a grieving widow who needed a shoulder to cry on. They saw a distraction. They knew I was drowning in the logistics of funeral arrangements, hospital bills, grief counseling, and pure emotional devastation. They calculated correctly that my guard would be completely down. They assumed that my profound sorrow would make me weak, compliant, and entirely incapable of fighting back. This is the hallmark of the toxic family dynamic. They rely on your emotional exhaustion to execute their agendas. They push you to the absolute brink of your sanity, hoping that you will simply collapse under the weight of it all and surrender. And why did they feel entitled to my inheritance in the first place? Because in the warped, delusional theater of my family's dynamic, I was never viewed as an equal. I was the supporting actress in the grand, glamorous production of Julian and Beatrice's lives. To them, the money my father left me wasn't mine because I wasn't a real person with real needs or real agency. I was just the quiet, boring little sister. How dare the quiet little sister hold the purse strings? How dare the designated loser of the family possess the one thing they desperately craved and continuously squandered? Financial power. When Beatrice looked at me and said, "What are you going to do with $2 million? Buy more black dresses?" That wasn't just a cruel insult. It was a projection of her own deep-seated insecurities. It was her desperate attempt to reinforce the artificial hierarchy she needed to survive. If I had power, her entire identity as the superior, successful older sister would shatter into a million pieces. So they stole it. They justified their felony theft by convincing themselves that they were simply correcting a mistake the universe had made. They believed they were inherently deserving of the wealth, regardless of whose name was on the trust, regardless of the law, and regardless of the fact that they were desecrating my husband's home on the day of his burial to get it. But here is the most critical lesson of this entire narrative, and it is the reason I am telling you this story today. It is the reason you need to subscribe to this community. When your narcissists feed on your emotional chaos, they are emotional vampires who sustain themselves on your tears, your screaming, your pleading, and your desperation. When Julian and Beatrice walked past me, bumping my shoulder, leaving me in that study with a stolen iPad and a drained bank account, they were waiting for the explosion. They wanted me to fall to my knees. They wanted me to scream at them, to beg them to reverse the wire transfer. They wanted a chaotic, messy fight, because a fight means they are in control. A fight means they have successfully triggered you. It means they still have their hooks buried deep inside your psyche. If I had screamed, Beatrice would have smiled. If I had cried, Julian would have felt like a god. They would have walked out of that house feeling powerful, justified, and victorious. But I gave them nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my dead husband's crystal tumbler against the mahogany wall. I simply looked at the screen, registered the data, and let the cold logic of survival take over. You see, while my family had spent the last decade treating me like a fragile, incompetent doormat, completely ignoring my career and treating my life as an afterthought, I had been busy. I hadn't been arguing with them. I hadn't been trying to prove my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me. I had been quietly, ruthlessly building an empire in the shadows. I learned very early on that you cannot negotiate with toxic people. You cannot love them into respecting you. You cannot explain your boundaries to them because they do not care about your boundaries. The only language a narcissist truly understands, the only metric of reality they actually respect, is absolute, undeniable, unyielding power. And true power doesn't scream. True power doesn't need to throw a tantrum at a funeral. True power doesn't need to forge a signature to steal $2 million. True power is owning the holding company that holds the debt on your arrogant brother's failing business. True power is being the anonymous founder of the private equity firm that bought the mortgage on your cruel sister's heavily leveraged fake luxury mansion. True power is holding the absolute destruction of their entire existence in the palm of your hand and choosing the exact perfect millisecond to crush them. My siblings mistook my silence for submission. They mistook my grief for weakness. They thought that because I didn't fight back with words, I was incapable of fighting back at all. They were about to learn that the quietest people in the room are often the most dangerous. They were about to learn that when you push a strong woman into a corner, when you desecrate her sanctuary, and when you steal from her on the darkest day of her life, she does not just get even. She annihilates the entire playing field. If you are listening to this, And you are currently trapped in a dynamic where your family constantly underestimates you, belittles your achievements, or treats you like a second-class citizen in your own life. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Stop arguing with them. Stop trying to prove your worth to people who are utterly committed to seeing you as a failure. Stop handing over your hard-earned money, your precious time, and your emotional energy to black holes that will never, ever be filled. Instead, take that energy and funnel it into yourself. Build your career in silence. Build your bank account in the shadows. Educate yourself, strengthen your mind, and construct an ironclad fortress of independence around your life. Let them think you are weak. Let them think you are small. Let them laugh at you behind your back. Their ignorance is your greatest tactical advantage. Because while they are busy maintaining their fake plastic facades, you are laying the concrete foundation of an empire they cannot even begin to comprehend. And one day, when they inevitably cross the line, when they reach their hands into your life trying to take what is yours, just like Julian and Beatrice did to me, you won't need to scream. You won't need to cry. You will simply press a button, make a phone call, or execute a legal maneuver and watch their entire illusion collapse into dust. I want to build an army of people who understand this philosophy. I want this channel to be a sanctuary for the scapegoats, the black sheep, the quiet builders, and the survivors who have realized that blood does not equal a blank check. So, before we move to the next chapter of this story, before we flash back and I explain exactly how the toxic dynamic of my family was formed, how Julian became the golden parasite, and how Beatrice became the queen of leveraged debt, and most importantly, how I quietly built the wealth required to buy their absolute ruin, I have one final request for you. Go into the comments down below. I want to read your stories. I want you to treat that comment section as a confessional, a journal, and a battleground. Tell me about the moment you finally realized your family was toxic. Tell me about the Julian or the Beatrice in your life, the golden child who gets everything while doing nothing. Tell me about the time they tried to steal from you, emotionally or financially. Have you ever had to cut a family member off? Have you ever had to walk away from the table because the disrespect was no longer being served? How did you find the strength to set that boundary? Share your experiences because your story, your survival, might be the exact catalyst someone else needs today to finally block their abuser's phone number, close their shared bank accounts, and walk away toward their own freedom. We are building a fortress here, brick by brick, story by story. Hit that like button so the algorithm pushes this message to every single person who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and prepare yourselves. Because what Julian and Beatrice thought was the end of my story was actually just the prologue to their absolute devastation. The bank accounts were at zero. The rain was still falling. But the storm I was about to unleash upon them was going to make this funeral look like a sunny day at the park. Stay with me. You are not going to want to miss a single second of what happens next. To truly comprehend the sheer, unadulterated audacity of what Julian and Beatrice did in my dead husband's study, you have to understand the poisoned soil in which their staggering entitlement was grown. You have to pull back the heavy velvet curtain on the Sterling family, a dynasty built entirely on smoke, mirrors, and a desperate, suffocating obsession with high society perception. Growing up, our childhood home was not a sanctuary. It was a sprawling, stone-faced Tudor mansion in the most exclusive zip code of Connecticut, and it operated more like a heavily guarded museum of illusions than a place where a family actually lived. My mother, Eleanor, was a woman whose entire neurological framework was constructed out of country club gossip, designer labels, and an absolute terror of being perceived as anything less than royalty. She was a woman who would rather max out a third secret credit card to buy a seasonal Chanel handbag than admit to her tennis group that my father's commercial real estate business had taken a hit that quarter. In this toxic, meticulously stage-managed theater, children were not viewed as human beings with individual needs or emotions. We were props. We were extensions of my parents' fragile egos, meant to be polished, paraded around at charity galas, and used as social currency. And in this deeply dysfunctional hierarchy, the roles were assigned the moment we were born. Julian was the firstborn son, the heir apparent, the golden prince. From the moment he took his first breath, my parents treated him as though he were destined to conquer the world, despite the fact that he possessed the work ethic of a sloth and the intellectual depth of a puddle. When Julian turned 16, he was gifted a brand new midnight black Porsche 911 wrapped in a massive red velvet bow on the circular driveway. He totaled it 6 months later while driving drunk on his way back from a Hamptons beach party. My parents didn't ground him. They didn't force him to get a job to pay for the damages. My mother simply smoothed his hair, kissed his forehead, and told the insurance company it was a mechanical failure. 2 weeks later, a brand new Range Rover appeared in the driveway. Julian's entire life was a series of spectacular, expensive failures that were immediately completely erased and aggressively funded by my father's dwindling bank accounts. In his 20s, Julian decided he was too visionary to work a traditional job, so he branded himself a tech entrepreneur. He launched a string of disastrous half-baked startup companies, a luxury dog-walking app, a cryptocurrency exchange for bespoke watches, a private concierge service for yachts he didn't own. Every single venture burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars of my father's seed money. Every single venture collapsed within a year. But at the Thanksgiving dinner table, Julian was always praised as the innovator of the family, the brave risk-taker, the brilliant mind who was just ahead of his time. Then there was Beatrice, the golden princess. Beatrice was my mother's carbon copy, a woman who learned very early on that physical beauty and a sharp, cruel tongue could unlock almost any door she wanted. Beatrice didn't just want to be rich. She wanted to be worshipped. Her life was an endless, exhausting curation of fake perfection. When she married her husband, a spineless middle management banker named Preston, my parents took out a second mortgage on the Tudor mansion just to fund a $400,000 destination wedding in Lake Como, Italy. They flew in 200 guests, hired a celebrity florist, and bought Beatrice a custom beaded gown that cost more than most people make in a decade. But beneath Beatrice's flawless, Botox-smoothed exterior and her Instagram feed full of private jets and five-star resorts, there was a rotting, terrifying reality. Beatrice and Preston were drowning in a suffocating ocean of leveraged debt. To maintain the illusion of their massive, multi-million-dollar lifestyle, they had taken out predatory loans, maxed out dozens of black cards, and were essentially living month to month, terrified that one day the house of cards would finally collapse. But to the family, Beatrice was the ultimate success story. She was the pristine socialite, the pride and joy of the sterling name. And then there was me, Elena, the youngest, the afterthought, the scapegoat. If Julian and Beatrice were the glittering, expensive chandeliers in the grand ballroom of my parents' lives, I was the plumbing. I was necessary to keep the house running, expected to remain completely out of sight, and only acknowledged when something needed to be cleaned up. I did not fit the sterling mold. I wasn't interested in country club politics. I didn't care about wearing the right designer labels, and I refused to play the exhausting game of pretending to be someone I wasn't. Because I didn't validate my mother's narcissism, and because I didn't feed my father's delusions of grandeur, I was actively punished for existing. While Julian drove his Range Rover and Beatrice strutted around in Prada, I was given a hand-me-down winter coat and told that if I wanted a car, I could get a job and buy one myself. So, I did. At 15, I worked 3 part-time jobs, tutoring math, bussing tables at a local diner, and doing data entry for a small accounting firm. I paid for my own clothes, my own school supplies, and my own mediocre, unreliable used Honda Civic. When I brought home straight A's and a full-ride academic scholarship to MIT for software engineering, there was no celebration dinner. There was no champagne. My mother simply looked at my acceptance letter, sighed, and said, "Engineering? Really, Elena? It's so blue-collar. Couldn't you have majored in art history like Beatrice? No man of any real status is going to want a woman who spends her life staring at a computer screen." They completely dismissed my intellect because they couldn't monetize it for social clout. And so, I learned the greatest survival tactic a scapegoat can ever master: absolute, impenetrable secrecy. I realized that any success I shared with them would either be aggressively belittled or violently stolen and redistributed to fund Julian and Beatrice's lavish failures. So I stopped sharing. I stopped seeking their approval. I retreated into the shadows, and in those shadows, I began to build an empire of my own. During my time at MIT, while my siblings were busy maxing out my father's credit cards on European vacations, I was awake at 3 a.m. in my cramped dorm room, fueled by cheap coffee and an unyielding, burning desire for financial independence. I wrote the code for a revolutionary data encryption algorithm designed specifically for the high-frequency trading sector. At 23 years old, I quietly sold the patent to a major Wall Street financial institution for $45 million. I didn't tell a single soul in my family. I didn't buy a flashy car or a diamond watch. I took that $45 million and I aggressively, methodically invested it. I quietly founded Obsidian Holdings, an anonymous private equity firm specializing in acquiring distressed debt and aggressively restructuring failing assets. Over the next decade, while my family continued to treat me like the pathetic, struggling younger sister who worked a boring computer job, Obsidian Holdings grew into a multi-billion-dollar titan in the financial sector. The only person who ever truly knew who I was and what I had built was David. I met David at an architectural gala I attended as an anonymous donor. He was brilliant, grounded, and possessed a quiet strength that immediately made me feel safe. He didn't care about the sterling family name, and he saw right through the superficial garbage of my upbringing. When I finally told him the truth about my wealth, about Obsidian Holdings, and about the deep, lingering scars of my childhood, he didn't blink. He just held my hand, looked me dead in the eye, and promised to help me build a fortress where none of them could ever hurt me again. And he did. We built a beautiful private life together, completely insulated from the toxic radiation of my blood relatives. But reality has a funny way of catching up to people who live entirely on credit. 2 years ago, my father's health rapidly declined. As he lay in his sterile, beeping hospital room, staring at the ceiling and confronting his own mortality, the grand illusion of his life finally shattered. He looked at his financial statements and realized the horrific truth. He had completely bankrupted himself funding Julian's failed tech ventures and bailing Beatrice out of her secret, spiraling debts. His commercial real estate empire was gone. The Tudor mansion was heavily mortgaged. He had absolutely nothing left to his name, except for one hidden, highly protected liquid trust account containing exactly $2 million. In his final weeks, My father called me to his bedside. He asked Julian and Beatrice to leave the room. He looked at me, his eyes hollowed out by illness and a profound, agonizing regret. For the first time in his entire life, he saw me. He didn't see the scapegoat. He saw the only one of his children who actually knew how to survive. "They are parasites, Elena," my father had whispered, his voice weak, trembling as he gripped my hand. "I ruined them. I gave them everything, and they consumed it all. If I leave this final account to them, Julian will burn it on another foolish venture in a month, and Beatrice will hand it straight to her creditors. It will be gone, and our family name will be nothing but a laughingstock." He had his lawyer draft the documents right there in the hospital. He placed the $2 million into a heavily restricted trust, making me the sole executor and beneficiary. It was not a gift of love. It was a desperate, final act of damage control. He knew I didn't need the money. He had finally pieced together that the sprawling architectural masterpiece David and I lived in wasn't paid for by a boring computer job. He left it to me because he knew I was the only vault impenetrable enough to keep it safe from the vultures he had raised. When he passed away and the will was read, the explosion was catastrophic. Julian screamed, throwing a crystal paperweight across the lawyer's mahogany conference room. Beatrice completely lost her mind, sobbing hysterically and accusing me of manipulating a dying, senile man. They could not fathom, they absolutely refused to accept, that the Golden children had been bypassed for the pathetic, quiet little sister. For 2 years they stewed in a toxic, venomous rage. They plotted, they whispered, and they waited for an opportunity to take back what their massive, fragile egos dictated was rightfully theirs. And they found their perfect opportunity in the tragic, untimely death of my husband. They saw my grief as a weapon to be used against me. They saw my vulnerability as a broken lock on the vault. Which brings us back to that dark, rain-streaked study, to the lingering smell of cheap perfume and stolen scotch, to the glowing iPad screen displaying a balance of $0 and 0 cents. Julian and Beatrice thought they had just executed the perfect heist. They thought they had finally put me back in my place, cementing their status as the untouchable, superior older siblings. They thought the $2 million was their golden ticket to maintaining their fake plastic empires. They had absolutely no idea that they had just stolen from the invisible billionaire who secretly controlled the very oxygen their fake lives required to breathe. They didn't know that 3 months prior, when Julian's latest disastrous AI logistics company defaulted on a massive, high-interest loan, the predatory lender had sold the debt. They didn't know that the debt was purchased by a shell corporation, which was a subsidiary of a holding company, which was entirely owned and operated by Obsidian Holdings. Julian didn't owe a bank anymore. Julian owed me. And Beatrice? Beautiful, arrogant Beatrice, who loved to mock my black dresses and call me a nobody. She didn't know that when her spineless husband missed 3 consecutive payments on the secret secondary mortgage they took out to fund their country club dues, the bank sold that toxic paper to clear their books. She didn't know that the private equity firm that bought the note on her heavily leveraged, fake luxury mansion was none other than Obsidian Holdings. I literally owned the roof over her head. They thought they had just taken my father's money. They didn't realize they had just given me the ultimate, legally binding excuse to completely annihilate them. I stared at the 0 balance on the screen, feeling the cold, clinical precision of my mind overriding the suffocating grief in my chest. It was time to flip the board. It was time to show the Golden children exactly what happens when you mistake a sleeping dragon for a doormat. The heavy oak door of David's study clicked softly shut behind Julian and Beatrice, leaving me alone in the dim, amber-lit silence. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the room was the relentless, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The storm outside was intensifying, violently lashing the glass, a chaotic mirror to the profound, earth-shattering betrayal that had just transpired. The scent of Julian's expensive, stolen scotch and Beatrice's suffocating, synthetic floral perfume hung in the air like a toxic vapor, invading the sanctuary that had always smelled of David's comforting cedarwood and old paper. I stood perfectly still in the center of the Persian rug, staring down at my iPad, which lay carelessly tossed onto the dark leather sofa. The screen had gone to sleep, returning to a sheer black mirror. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cool glass, and tapped the home button. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across my pale face. Available balance, $0. A lesser woman would have shattered in that exact moment. A woman who had internalized the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, and the relentless narrative of her own insignificance would have fallen to her knees, weeping hysterically onto the imported rugs. She would have chased them down the hall, screaming, begging, pleading for a scrap of mercy from people whose hearts were entirely hollow. But I was not that woman. My family had spent 34 years looking right at me and seeing absolutely nothing. They saw a pathetic, introverted bookworm. They saw a woman who wore modest black dresses instead of flashing designer logos. They saw a convenient doormat. They did not see the architect of their impending destruction. I locked the iPad and tossed it onto the mahogany desk. I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of my late husband. The agonizing, suffocating grief that had been paralyzing my lungs all afternoon didn't disappear. It merely metamorphosed. The sorrow crystallized, hardening under unimaginable pressure, until it transformed into something entirely different. A cold, hyper-focused, and violently calculating rage. I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was the CEO of Obsidian Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar apex predator in the financial sector. And my prey had just willingly walked into the slaughterhouse. I walked over to the massive, built-in mahogany bookshelves that line the far wall of the study. I bypassed the leather-bound classics and stopped in front of a heavy, oversized volume on brutalist architecture. I pulled the book forward, revealing a sleek, flush-mounted biometric scanner hidden in the dark wood paneling. I pressed my thumb against the glass. A microscopic laser scanned my print. The LED flashed a quiet, affirming green, and a concealed, fireproof wall safe seamlessly popped open. Inside sat a matte black, military-grade encrypted laptop. It was a terminal entirely disconnected from any public network, routing through a series of offshore proxies. The nerve center of my empire. I carried the laptop to David's desk, gently pushing aside the forged power of attorney documents Beatrice had scattered in her haste. I sat down in the heavy leather chair, the exact spot where Julian had just sat to steal my inheritance. I flipped the screen open and engaged the multi-factor authentication protocol. As the Obsidian Holdings custom operating system booted up, bathing the dark room in a stark, clinical white light, the temperature in my veins seemed to drop to absolute zero. It was time to audit the Sterling family. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a practiced, predatory speed. I bypassed the main corporate dashboards, the multi-million-dollar real estate acquisitions, and the international hedge fund analytics, navigating directly to a highly classified, heavily restricted subdirectory labeled Acquired Distressed Debt, Special Projects. I clicked on the first heavily encrypted file. Subject, Julian Sterling. Entity, Vanguard Logistics, LLC. Julian's entire existence was a carefully constructed, heavily financed lie. Vanguard Logistics was his latest genius startup, an AI-driven supply chain management firm that, in reality, produced absolutely nothing. It was essentially a vehicle to fund his lifestyle, a way to write off his luxury condo in downtown Chicago, his leased fleet of high-end sports cars, and his relentless, exorbitant networking dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. 3 months ago, Julian had burned through the last of his initial investor capital. Desperate to keep up appearances and terrified of having to admit failure, he had sought out a massive short-term mezzanine loan from a notoriously aggressive shadow lender. He needed $3 million, fast. Because traditional banks had flagged his abysmal credit and lack of tangible revenue long ago, he had signed a predatory contract with terms so draconian they bordered on financial suicide. To secure the loan, Julian had cross-collateralized absolutely everything he had ever touched. He put up the operating capital of the business, the equity in his downtown condo, the titles to his cars, and, most fatally, he had signed a personal, unlimited guarantee. What Julian's bloated ego had prevented him from realizing was that he was not dealing with a standard lender. Within 48 hours of that ink drying, Obsidian Holdings, acting through a layered web of anonymous shell corporations, had legally purchased the debt. I scrolled through the PDF of Julian's master loan agreement, my eyes scanning the dense, incredibly complex legalese until I found the exact paragraph I was looking for. Section 8, Clause 4B, the Acceleration and Seizure Protocol. It was a beautiful, devastating piece of corporate law. It stipulated that, in the event of any fraudulent financial activity, criminal investigation, or material breach of trust by the borrower, the lender maintained the immediate, unilateral right to call the entire principal of the loan due in full, without any prior written notice. If the borrower could not produce the $3 million liquid within exactly 1 hour, the lender possessed the legal authority to freeze all linked commercial and personal accounts and initiate the immediate seizure of all collateralized assets. By stealing the $2 million from my trust account today, Julian had just committed federal wire fraud. He had triggered the trap. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single, solitary ounce of pity. I moved the cursor to the master control panel of the debt portal. I selected Julian's entire portfolio, typed in my authorization credentials, and clicked the flashing red button labeled Execute Acceleration Protocol and Initiate Asset Freeze. In that exact fraction of a second, an automated, legally binding cascade of financial ruin was unleashed into the digital ether. Encrypted orders were instantly dispatched to the holding banks. Within minutes, Julian's business accounts would lock. His personal checking accounts would freeze. His precious, diamond-encrusted credit cards would decline. The illusion was over. I immediately opened the second file. Subject: Beatrice Sterling Pell. Entity: the Fairfield Estate. If Julian was a master of corporate delusion, Beatrice was the undisputed queen of domestic facade. Her entire identity, her superiority complex, and her unearned arrogance were intrinsically tied to her sprawling 8-bedroom fake luxury estate in the most expensive zip code in Fairfield County. It was the house where she hosted her pretentious charity galas, where she filmed her sickeningly perfect social media videos, and where she looked down on the rest of the world from her imported marble balconies. But Beatrice and her spineless husband Preston couldn't actually afford the property taxes, let alone the mortgage. To fund their absurd lifestyle and Beatrice's crippling addiction to seasonal designer wardrobes, they had taken out a massive, high-interest secondary balloon mortgage. It was an act of desperate, breathtaking financial stupidity. And naturally, Obsidian Holdings had purchased that paper too. I pulled up the payment history. Beatrice and Preston were currently 94 days delinquent on their payments. They had been dodging calls, throwing away letters, and praying for a miracle. According to the hyper-aggressive terms of the note that I now owned, a 90-day delinquency allowed the lender to bypass traditional foreclosure negotiations and immediately file a notice of default with the county, triggering an accelerated eviction process and the seizure of the property to cover the toxic debt. The grace period had legally expired at midnight the night before. They had walked into my husband's funeral completely bankrupt, entirely unaware that the executioner's axe was hovering millimeters above their heavily manicured necks. I initiated the foreclosure protocol. I digitally signed the release documents, automatically transmitting them to my elite team of ruthless corporate attorneys with a single, unbending directive. File it immediately. Dispatch the recovery teams. Leave them with nothing. I closed the laptop. The screen went black, plunging the study back into shadows. The entire process had taken less than 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, while my siblings were out in my living room drinking my dead husband's expensive champagne and celebrating their successful theft, I had legally, systematically, and irrevocably erased their entire financial existence. I stood up from the desk, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in my black morning dress. I checked my reflection in the dark glass of the window. My eyes were no longer red from crying. They were dark, endless, and completely empty of mercy. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, grabbed the brass handle, and stepped out of the shadows. The transition from the quiet, dark study to the grand living room was jarring. The space was massive, an architectural marvel of glass and steel, filled with dozens of guests dressed in somber black. But the atmosphere was utterly disrespectful. It did not feel like a wake. It felt like a low-rent country club mixer. Distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years were clustered near the floor-to-ceiling windows, whispering and laughing quietly. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd, carrying silver trays of caviar and Prosecco. And holding court in the very center of the room, standing beside a massive arrangement of white orchids, were the Golden Children. Julian was leaning against the marble fireplace, one hand casually tucked into his perfectly tailored trousers, the other holding a fresh glass of bourbon. He was regaling a group of my father's old business associates with an exaggerated, entirely fabricated story about his latest tech venture, his Rolex catching the light as he gestured arrogantly. Beatrice was standing a few feet away, surrounded by a gaggle of her vapid, social climbing friends. She had completely discarded the facade of the grieving sister. Her oversized sunglasses were pushed back onto her head, and she was loudly complaining about the catering, her acrylic nails tapping against a crystal flute. "I mean, it's a beautiful house, obviously," I heard Beatrice say, her voice carrying over the low hum of the crowd. "But it's just so sterile. Typical Elena. No warmth, no taste. Thank God she has us to step in and handle things now. The poor thing is completely lost without a man to pay the bills." A sickening chorus of sympathetic, patronizing murmurs rippled through her circle. I walked slowly through the crowd. The guests parted from me instinctively, sensing the sudden, drastic shift in the air pressure. The quiet, pathetic little sister was gone. Every step I took against the imported Italian marble floor echoed with the weight of absolute, untouchable authority. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from them. "Julian, Beatrice," I said. My voice was not loud. It was not a scream. It was a perfectly modulated, terrifyingly calm command that sliced through the ambient noise of the room like a scalpel. The chatter instantly died. The clinking of glasses ceased. Several dozen heads turned toward the center of the room. Julian stopped mid-sentence, his arrogant smirk freezing on his face. He looked at me, annoyed by the interruption. Beatrice rolled her eyes dramatically, letting out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "Elena, for God's sake!" Beatrice hissed, stepping forward and lowering her voice to a harsh, condescending whisper. What are you doing? You are making a scene. Go back to your room and rest. The adults are handling the guests. I am not making a scene, Beatrice, I replied, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the massive room. I am simply concluding a business transaction, Julian scoffed, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his bourbon. A business transaction? What are you talking about? Are you hallucinating from the grief? Have another glass of water, Elena. I reached into the pocket of my black dress and pulled out my iPhone. I tapped the screen, opening the internal Obsidian Holdings administrative app, and held it casually by my side. 30 minutes ago, in my late husband's private study, the two of you forged my physical signature on an outdated power of attorney document, I said, my voice completely flat, completely devoid of emotion. You then stole my personal device, bypassed the security code, and executed an unauthorized wire transfer of $2 million from my father's protected trust into your offshore joint account. A collective gasp echoed through the room. The faces of the surrounding relatives went completely white. Beatrice's jaw dropped, her heavily manicured hand flying to her chest in feigned shock.
How dare you!
Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking, her carefully constructed facade instantly cracking under the public accusation. You are hysterical! You are absolutely insane! We did no such thing! She's lost her mind, Julian added quickly, though I could see a microscopic bead of sweat forming on his temple. He looked around the room, desperately trying to maintain eye contact with the murmuring guests. The grief has broken her reality. We were simply reviewing some estate documents. Do not insult my intelligence, Julian. And do not try to gaslight a room full of witnesses. I cut him off, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with an ironclad dominance they had never heard from me before. I have 4K motion-activated security cameras installed in every single room of this estate, including the study. The entire transaction, the forgery, the theft, and your disgusting, arrogant little celebration was recorded in high-definition video and audio. A copy has already been automatically uploaded to my secure cloud server, and a second copy has been transmitted to my legal counsel. The color rapidly drained from Julian's face. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, sickening terror. He looked at Beatrice, whose eyes were wide with pure panic. They hadn't considered cameras. They thought I was too stupid, too trusting to protect my own sanctuary. Now listen to me very carefully, I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward them. The crowd instinctively took a step back, giving me a wide berth. I do not care about the $2 million. To me, $2 million is a rounding error. It is pocket change. I let you take it because I needed you to commit the felony. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. What are you talking about, Elena? Pocket change. You're an accountant. You don't have... I am the anonymous founder and CEO of Obsidian Holdings, I stated, the words falling like heavy anvils onto the marble floor. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence blanketed the room. The name of the multi-billion-dollar private equity titan was recognized by several of my father's old business associates in the crowd. I heard a man in the back whisper, "Good God." I looked directly into Julian's terrified eyes. And through a subsidiary shell corporation, Obsidian Holdings happens to own the entirety of the $3 million highly leveraged mezzanine debt you took out to fund your pathetic, failing logistics company, Julian. Julian physically staggered back, his shoulders hitting the marble fireplace. The crystal bourbon glass slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering violently against the floor, splashing amber liquid across his expensive leather shoes. "No," Julian whispered, his voice trembling, the reality of the trap closing around his throat. "No, that's impossible. You can't. Read your loan agreement, Julian," Section 8, Clause 4B, I recited, my eyes locking onto him like a sniper's scope. Any fraudulent activity by the borrower grants the lender the immediate, unilateral right to call the principal and freeze all assets. By committing felony wire fraud on my network 30 minutes ago, you pulled the trigger for me. As of 5 minutes ago, your business accounts are frozen. Your personal accounts are locked. The cars you leased are currently being reported as stolen by the lien holder. You are completely, hopelessly bankrupt. I didn't wait for his response. I slowly turned my head, locking my gaze onto Beatrice. She was trembling so violently that the champagne in her flute was spilling over the rim, dripping down her expensive black dress. "And you, Beatrice," I said softly, stepping into her personal space. She shrank back, terrified of the monster she had awakened. "Did you really think a 12% interest balloon mortgage from a shadow lender wouldn't eventually find its way to the secondary market? Did you think you could just ignore the delinquency notices forever?" Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless squeak came out. "You are 94 days delinquent on the Fairfield estate," I told her, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. "Obsidian Holdings owns that paper. You stole from me to try and pay it off, but you were too late. 5 minutes ago, I authorized the immediate filing of a notice of default. The grace period is over. The foreclosure is active. By tomorrow morning, there will be a padlock on your custom mahogany front doors, and your designer wardrobe will be sitting on the curb." I took a final step back, looking at the 2 golden children. They were completely stripped of their armor, standing exposed, humiliated, and utterly destroyed in front of the very high society crowd they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. They looked small. They looked pathetic. They looked exactly like the terrified, incompetent parasites they truly were. "You spent my entire life treating me like a doormat," I said, my voice resonating with absolute, unshakable finality. "You mistook my silence for weakness. You mistook my grief for an opportunity. You thought you could walk into my home on the day I buried the only person who ever truly loved me and steal my future." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. "You wanted to steal my inheritance to maintain your fake empires? Congratulations. You got the $2 million, but it cost you everything else. The game is over, and you both lost." The silence that followed my declaration was not merely the absence of noise. It was a physical, crushing weight that settled over the grand living room. It was the kind of silence that precedes a massive tectonic shift, the eerie stillness right before the tsunami hits the shoreline. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the storm raged on, the heavy rain hammering against the reinforced panes, completely oblivious to the catastrophic destruction that had just been unleashed inside my home. Julian remained frozen against the marble fireplace, his bespoke Italian leather shoes soaking in the puddle of his spilled, expensive bourbon. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow jerks. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy had vanished, replaced by a terrified man desperately trying to process the fact that the invisible little sister he had spent 34 years tormenting held his literal existence in her hands. "You're lying," Julian choked out. His voice was no longer the booming, confident baritone that had commanded boardrooms and cocktail parties. It was a pathetic, raspy whisper. He forced a sickeningly hollow laugh, looking around the room at the sea of pale, shocked faces. "It's a bluff. She's bluffing. Obsidian Holdings is a multi-billion-dollar ghost firm. They don't just buy up random tech debt. You're out of your mind, Elena." Beatrice latched onto his denial like a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood. She frantically wiped the spilled champagne from her couture dress, smearing the dark fabric. Exactly! You're a low-level accountant. You're grieving. This is a psychotic break. Everyone, please, just ignore her. She needs medical help. She turned to her circle of vapid, high-society friends, flashing a desperate, brittle smile, silently begging them to validate her delusion. But her friends didn't smile back. They simply stared at her, their expressions a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. In the ruthless, predatory world of high society, the stench of sudden poverty is a highly contagious disease, and Beatrice was suddenly bleeding out on the marble floor. They subtly, almost imperceptibly, took a collective step backward, physically distancing themselves from the blast radius. I don't need to bluff, Julian, I said, my voice cutting through their desperate delusions like a diamond-tipped drill. I don't play games with children. I execute corporate strategy. As if on cue, a sharp, piercing sound shattered the silence of the room. It was Julian's cell phone. The device, resting inside the breast pocket of his midnight blue Armani suit, began to vibrate frantically, playing an obnoxious, upbeat ringtone that echoed violently off the soaring ceilings. Julian flinched as if he had been physically struck. He stared down at his own chest, his eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. Answer it, Julian, I commanded quietly, the absolute authority in my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. I believe your chief financial officer is trying to reach you. It would be rude to keep him waiting. Julian's trembling hand slowly reached into his jacket. He pulled out the sleek, customized smartphone. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim room. Marcus, CFO, Vanguard. Julian swallowed hard, a thick bead of cold sweat tracing a path down his temple. He swiped the screen with a shaking thumb and, in his panic, fumbled the device, accidentally engaging the speakerphone feature before pressing it against his ear. Julian, where the hell are you? Marcus's panicked, frantic voice blasted through the speaker, echoing across the silent living room for every single guest to hear. Are you listening to me? It's gone! Everything is locked! Julian, I don't care where you are! Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. I was just trying to authorize payroll, and the main operating account declined. I called the bank, and they told me the mezzanine loan was accelerated 10 minutes ago. All of our lines of credit have been suspended. The corporate cards are declining. Julian, they froze the holding accounts. We don't have a single red cent. They are initiating seizure protocols right now. What did you do? A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the crowd. The older, distinguished business associates, men my father had courted for decades, men Julian had been desperately trying to network with just minutes prior, now looked at him with absolute, unadulterated disgust. To these men, failure was embarrassing, but corporate fraud and absolute bankruptcy were unforgivable sins. Marcus, I'll fix it. I'm fixing it right now, Julian stammered, his face draining of all remaining color, turning a sickly, translucent gray. Fix it? With what? Marcus yelled. They sent a default notice to the board. You signed a personal guarantee, Julian. You cross-collateralized your condo. You're ruined. We're all ruined. The call abruptly disconnected, replaced by the flat, dead tone of the dialer. Julian slowly lowered the phone. His arm fell limply to his side. The bespoke suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him, hanging off a man who had just been instantly hollowed out. You see, Julian, I said, stepping closer to him, the click of my heels against the marble sounding like the ticking of a doomsday clock. When you build your entire life on a foundation of leveraged debt and unearned arrogance, it only takes a single, precisely placed wrecking ball to bring the entire facade crashing down. You thought you were a titan of industry. You were just a highly financed liability. And I just liquidated you. But the financial execution was only the first phase of their destruction. The visual, undeniable proof of their ruin was about to arrive. A sudden, flashing light caught the attention of the guests standing near the front of the living room. It wasn't lightning. It was a rhythmic, pulsing amber glow cutting through the dark, torrential rain. "Oh my God," whispered one of my aunts, pointing a trembling finger toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the circular, cobblestone driveway. Every head in the room turned. Rolling slowly up the winding driveway of my estate, their heavy diesel engines rumbling over the sound of the rain, were two massive, heavy-duty commercial tow trucks. Their yellow hazard lights painted the manicured lawns and the dark glass windows of my home with a violent, urgent strobe. "No," Julian whispered, his eyes widening in absolute horror as the trucks pulled to a halt right in front of the grand entrance. "No, no, no, they can't do this here. Not here." The recovery agents didn't care about the funeral. They didn't care about the high society guests watching from the windows. They operated on automated corporate directives, and Obsidian Holdings had authorized an aggressive, zero-tolerance seizure protocol. Two men in heavy yellow raincoats jumped out of the first truck. They completely ignored my panicked valet driver, walking straight up to the crown jewel of Julian's fake empire, his customized, matte black 2025 Porsche 911 Turbo. It was the car he endlessly bragged about, the vehicle he used to project an aura of immense, untouchable success. Within 60 seconds, they had the heavy steel winch secured to the Porsche's front axle. "Stop them!" Julian suddenly shrieked, the reality of his public humiliation finally snapping his mind. He lunged away from the fireplace, sprinting toward the massive oak front doors. "That's my car! You can't take my car!" He burst through the front doors, running out into the torrential rain in his ruined Armani suit. The guests watched through the glass, entirely spellbound by the pathetic spectacle unfolding in the driveway. "Hey! Get your hands off my vehicle!" Julian screamed, slipping on the wet cobblestone and nearly falling to his knees as he reached the tow truck operator. The burly man in the yellow raincoat didn't even flinch. He calmly pulled a laminated clipboard from his jacket and shoved it into Julian's chest. "Julian Sterling?" the man asked gruffly over the roar of the rain and the diesel engine. "Yes, I am the CEO of Vanguard Logistics. You are making a massive mistake. Unhook my car right now or I will sue you into the ground," Julian roared, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his expensive suit instantly soaked through. "Save it for the judge, pal," the operator said, completely unimpressed. "The lien holder initiated an emergency repossession 10 minutes ago due to a breach of contract and acceleration of debt. You don't own this vehicle anymore. Step away from the machinery or I'll have the police remove you for obstruction." The operator hit a lever, and with a whining mechanical grind, Julian's pristine, matte black Porsche was violently yanked up the steel ramp of the flatbed. Julian stood in the pouring rain, completely paralyzed, watching the physical embodiment of his ego being dragged away like a piece of worthless scrap metal. He looked back through the massive glass windows of my home, seeing 80 of his peers, relatives, and business idols watching his absolute disgrace. But the nightmare wasn't over. The second tow truck, a massive wrecker, reversed aggressively toward the pristine white Mercedes G-Wagon, parked just a few feet away, Beatrice's car. Inside the living room, Beatrice let out a blood-curdling shriek. "My G-Wagon! Preston, do something! They're taking my car!" She frantically grabbed the arm of her spineless husband, digging her acrylic nails into his suit jacket. Preston, a man who had spent his entire marriage terrified of his wife's temper, simply stared at the floor, his face completely pale. He knew exactly what this was. He knew they hadn't made a payment in 4 months. "Preston, fix this!" Beatrice screamed, her perfect manicured facade completely shattering into a hysterical, ugly mess. Suddenly, her designer handbag, sitting on a nearby marble side table, began to chime violently. It wasn't a phone call. It was a rapid-fire succession of high-pitched alerts. Beatrice lunged for the bag, ripping it open and pulling out her diamond-encrusted iPhone. It was an alert from her home security system. Beatrice stared at the glowing screen, her heavily mascaraed eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing terror. She tapped the notification, bringing up the live 4K feed from the front porch of her heavily leveraged, 8-bedroom Fairfield estate. The video feed was clear. Standing on her imported mahogany front porch were 2 men in dark suits, flanked by a uniformed county sheriff. One of the men in suits was actively drilling through the lock of her custom front door, while the other was hammering a bright orange, legally binding document onto the wood paneling. Notice of default and immediate foreclosure. Property seized. "My house," Beatrice gasped, all the air rushing out of her lungs in a single, pathetic wheeze. "They're at my house. They're changing the locks." She looked up, her eyes wild, frantic, searching the room for salvation. She looked at her friends, the women she drank mimosas with, the women she plotted and gossiped with. "Sylvia," Beatrice pleaded, stumbling toward a tall, blonde woman dripping in diamonds. "Sylvia, my accounts. There must be a glitch. My bank made an error. Just let me use your black card to book a suite at the Four Seasons until I sort this out. Please." Sylvia looked at Beatrice as if she were a rotting corpse. She physically recoiled, pulling her designer clutch tightly to her chest. "I don't think so, Beatrice," Sylvia said, her voice dripping with ice-cold, aristocratic disdain. "It sounds to me like you've been living a lie this entire time. I always wondered how you afforded that estate on Preston's mediocre salary. You're a fraud. Please, don't speak to me again." Sylvia turned on her heel and walked away. The rest of the circle immediately followed suit, turning their backs on the weeping, completely destroyed Golden Princess. Social exile was instantaneous. In a span of less than 15 minutes, Beatrice had gone from the queen of her fake empire to a homeless, socially radioactive outcast. Out in the driveway, the tow trucks engaged their heavy gears, the massive diesel engines roaring as they pulled forward. Through the glass, the guests watched as Julian's Porsche and Beatrice's G-Wagon were driven away into the dark, stormy afternoon, the amber hazard lights fading into the distance. Julian slowly trudged back into the house. He pushed through the heavy oak doors, completely drenched, shivering violently. Puddles of rainwater formed around his ruined Italian shoes. He looked like a drowned rat. The arrogant smirk, the superiority, the blinding entitlement, it was all completely, irrevocably gone. He walked slowly into the center of the living room, stopping next to his sister. Beatrice was on her knees on the imported marble floor, her face buried in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Her expensive mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, black rivers. She was surrounded by the shattered glass of Julian's bourbon glass, a perfectly fitting metaphor for their destroyed lives. The golden children were broken. They were stripped of their wealth, their status, their homes, their cars, and their dignity. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. I stood 10 feet away from them, perfectly composed, my black dress completely dry, my posture immaculate. The contrast was stark, visceral, and incredibly satisfying. I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt. I didn't feel a drop of pity. The agonizing, suffocating grief that had been crushing my chest all day felt strangely lighter, replaced by the profound, cleansing heat of absolute justice. My husband had spent his life building a safe haven for me, and I had just aggressively, violently protected it. I looked down at the 2 pathetic figures cowering on my floor. $2 million, I said softly, the words carrying perfectly in the dead silence of the room. You threw away your entire lives, your reputations, and your futures for $2 million. Julian slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red, utterly defeated. "Elena, please," Julian whispered, his voice cracking, the ultimate submission finally forced from his lips. "Please, we're your family. We're blood. You can't just leave us with nothing." Beatrice looked up from her hands, her face a streaked, ruined mess. "Where are we supposed to go, Elena? They took my house. They took my car. My cards are declining. We don't have anywhere to go." "I suggest you do what you've spent 34 years telling me to do," I replied, my voice completely devoid of mercy, radiating absolute, freezing zero. I looked dead into their eyes. Figure it out. The echo of those 3 final, devastating words, "figure it out," hung in the air of the grand living room like the lingering smoke of a fired cannon. Julian and Beatrice, the golden children of the Sterling dynasty, remained crumpled on the imported Italian marble floor. They were no longer the arrogant, untouchable socialites who had confidently strutted past me in the study just 30 minutes prior. They were completely, fundamentally broken, reduced to shivering, sobbing masses of ruined designer fabric and shattered egos. I did not offer them a hand. I did not offer them a tissue. I simply looked past them, lifting my gaze to the sea of terrified faces surrounding us. The 80 high society guests, the distant aunts, the wealthy uncles, the pretentious country club friends, and the corporate sycophants were absolutely petrified. They were staring at me with a profound, primitive fear. The quiet, pathetic little sister in the plain black dress had just publicly executed the 2 most prominent members of their social circle with a terrifying, clinical precision, and she hadn't even raised her voice to do it. I caught the eye of my Aunt Sylvia, the woman who had just minutes ago completely abandoned Beatrice. Sylvia gulped, her diamond necklace trembling against her collarbone, and she immediately averted her gaze, staring at the floor in absolute submission. The hierarchy had not just been shifted, it had been completely incinerated, and I was the only one left standing in the ashes. I raised my right hand, a single, subtle gesture. From the shadows of the grand foyer, 3 men in immaculate, tailored black suits immediately stepped forward. Leading them was Vance, my head of private security, a towering, broad-shouldered former military contractor who had managed my personal safety for the past 5 years. Vance possessed eyes like chipped flint and a demeanor that completely neutralized any threat before it even materialized. Vance walked across the room, his heavy footsteps echoing with absolute authority, and stopped 2 feet behind me. "Ma'am," Vance said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "The reception has concluded, Vance," I said smoothly, my eyes never leaving the pathetic forms of my siblings on the floor. "Please inform the guests that it is time to leave. And as for these 2, I finally looked down at Julian, who was staring up at me with hollow, desperate eyes. "They are no longer welcome on this property. Escort them past the main gates. If they resist, or if they attempt to return, do not hesitate to contact local law enforcement and have them arrested for criminal trespassing." "Understood, ma'am," Vance replied, immediately motioning for his team. "Elena, please!" Julian croaked, scrambling backward like a cornered animal as 2 massive security guards approached him. "My shoes are ruined! It's freezing outside! Our cars are gone! How are we supposed to get home?" "That sounds like a logistical issue, Julian," I replied, my voice an icy, impenetrable wall. "Perhaps you should consult the CEO of Vanguard Logistics. Oh, wait. He's bankrupt." Beatrice let out a high-pitched, hysterical wail as a guard firmly grabbed her by the elbow of her ruined mink coat, forcing her to her feet. "Preston! Call us an Uber! Preston, do something!" she shrieked, thrashing against the guard's iron grip. But I didn't wait to watch them be dragged out. I turned my back on the Golden Children forever. I began to walk. The crowd of high society guests immediately scrambled out of my path, parting like the Red Sea before a terrifying, unstoppable force. They pressed themselves against the glass windows and the walls, holding their collective breath as I passed. I could feel their eyes on me, wide with a mixture of absolute horror and immense, undeniable respect. The click of my black stilettos against the marble floor fell into a slow, rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. Every step I took felt lighter than the last. It was as if a massive, suffocating chain that had been anchored to my chest since the day I was born was finally, violently snapping link by link. I walked past the towering arrangements of white orchids. I walked past the silver trays of untouched champagne. I walked past the ghosts of my parents' expectations, the decades of relentless belittling, and the deeply ingrained toxic lie that I was somehow less than the people who shared my blood. I approached the massive floating glass and steel staircase that led up to the private sanctuary of the second floor. As I placed my hand on the cool steel railing and began to ascend, the chaotic sounds of the living room below, the muffled gasps of the guests, the panicked, pathetic pleading of Julian, the hysterical sobbing of Beatrice, began to fade into a distant, irrelevant white noise. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the long, carpeted hallway, stopping in front of the double mahogany doors of the master suite. I pushed them open. The room was vast, quiet, and completely insulated from the toxic radiation downstairs. It smelled faintly of David's cedarwood cologne and fresh linen. It was the space where we had spent countless hours dreaming, building, and loving each other without the interference of the outside world. I walked past our king-sized bed and approached the massive, floor-to-ceiling sliding glass doors that opened out onto the master terrace. I unlocked the latch, pushed the heavy glass aside, and stepped out into the elements. The storm that had raged all afternoon was finally beginning to break. The torrential downpour had softened into a cool, cleansing mist, and a sharp, biting wind whipped across the sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate, rustling the fabric of my black morning dress. Far off in the western horizon, the heavy charcoal clouds were fracturing, allowing a single, brilliant, golden beam of late afternoon sunlight to pierce through the darkness, illuminating the rain-slicked valley below. I walked to the edge of the glass railing, placing my hands on the cool, wet metal, and looked down at the winding, mile-long cobblestone driveway. Far below, I watched as Vance and his security team physically escorted the remaining guests out of the front doors. The luxury sedans and town cars were hastily brought around by the valets, and the distant relatives piled in, desperate to escape the blast radius of the Sterling family's absolute ruin. And then I saw them. Julian and Beatrice. They were stumbling down the center of the driveway, completely exposed to the elements. Without their expensive cars, without their fake money, and without their sycophantic friends, they were just two small, pathetic figures struggling to walk in the rain. Julian was slipping in his leather dress shoes, his ruined suit clinging to his shivering frame, his shoulders hunched in absolute defeat. Beside him, Beatrice was limping, having taken off her soaked designer heels, walking barefoot on the cold, wet cobblestone, dragging her heavy, wet mink coat behind her like a dead weight. They looked exactly like what they were, parasites that had finally been severed from their host. I watched them shrink into the distance. They grew smaller and smaller with every step they took toward the heavy iron gates of my estate. They didn't look back. They couldn't. I watched until they passed through the gates, turning down the desolate, winding mountain road, completely vanishing from my life forever. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back, letting the cool, cleansing mist wash over my face. I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, undeniable scent of total, absolute freedom. The grief of losing David still ached in my chest, a profound, heavy sorrow that would take time to heal. But for the first time in my entire 34 years of existence, my sanctuary was entirely my own. The walls were secured. The toxic liabilities had been liquidated. I was a self-made titan, a woman who had taken her power back in the most ruthless, undeniable way possible, and my peace was officially untouchable. I opened my eyes, looking out at the golden sunlight spreading across the horizon. I touched the cold diamond wedding band on my left hand, a silent promise to the man who had helped me build this fortress. The scapegoat was dead. The quiet little sister was gone. Only the CEO remained. The image of Julian and Beatrice stumbling down that long, rain-slicked driveway, completely stripped of their fake wealth, their unearned arrogance, and their social standing, is where the narrative of my family officially ends. Let the screen fade to black on their pathetic, shivering silhouettes. Let the heavy iron gates swing shut and lock behind them. Let the storm wash away every single trace of their existence from my property. Now, I want to bring the focus back into the room with you. I want to step out of the shadows of that multi-million-dollar estate, look directly through this camera lens, and speak to your soul. What you just witnessed was not merely a story about a massive financial execution, though the poetic justice of bankrupting my abusers was undeniably sweet. What you witnessed was a masterclass in the absolute, uncompromising necessity of boundary setting. It was the story of a woman who finally realized that she held the pen to her own life, and she chose to cross out the toxic characters who were ruining the script. For too long, society has aggressively conditioned us to believe a very dangerous, very toxic lie. We are force-fed the narrative that family is everything. We are told by religious institutions, by movies, by well-meaning but entirely ignorant friends, that you must always forgive your blood relatives. We are handed these blanket platitudes. Be the bigger person. Don't hold a grudge. At the end of the day, they're still your parents. She's still your sister. He's still your brother. I am here to tell you, with absolute, unflinching certainty, that those phrases are nothing more than the linguistic shackles used by abusers to keep their victims securely tied to the whipping post. Blood does not equal a blank check. Sharing 50% of your DNA with another human being does not grant them a lifelong VIP, all-access pass to disrespect you, steal from you, belittle your achievements, or drain your emotional and financial resources. Biology is a geographic accident of your birth. It is not a binding moral contract that forces you to endure a lifetime of psychological warfare. When my siblings forged my signature and stole that $2 million from my dying husband's sanctuary, they did not do it because they hated me. It was actually much worse than that. They did it because they believed I did not matter. They believed that because I was the scapegoat, the quiet, accommodating younger sister, my resources inherently belonged to them. They viewed me not as a human being who was actively grieving the love of her life, but as an ATM, a resource, a stepping stone to maintain their own fraudulent illusions of grandeur. And if you are listening to this right now, I know exactly what you are feeling, because you have your own Julian and Beatrice in your life. Maybe your Julian is a father who only calls you when he needs you to co-sign a loan, completely ignoring the fact that you are struggling to pay your own rent. Maybe your Beatrice is a mother who uses every family gathering to humiliate you in front of relatives, actively tearing down your career, your weight, or your relationship to make herself feel superior. Maybe it's a sibling who emotionally blackmails you into funding their endless, disastrous life choices, weaponizing your guilt to keep their head above water while actively pushing you under. Whatever form your abuser takes, the absolute truth remains the same. You cannot save people who are actively trying to drown you. You cannot build a beautiful, peaceful, successful life while simultaneously funding the chaos of people who are committed to misunderstanding you. There is a profound, deeply ingrained guilt that comes with cutting off toxic family members. It is a guilt that will keep you awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, wondering if you are a terrible person for finally locking the door. You will ask yourself, did I try hard enough? Should I have given them one more chance? Am I really as selfish as they say I am? Listen to me very carefully. Setting boundaries is not selfish. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. When I froze Julian's accounts and initiated the foreclosure on Beatrice's house, I was not acting out of malice. I was simply enforcing the consequences of their own actions. I stopped shielding them from reality. For 34 years, my parents, and eventually the world, had buffered them from the catastrophic results of their incompetence. I simply removed the buffer. I let gravity do its job. If you continue to be the safety net for toxic people, they will never, ever learn how to walk on the tightrope. They will simply jump over and over again, expecting you to catch them, completely indifferent to the fact that the weight of their failures is breaking your spine. You have to drop the net. You have to understand that true peace, the kind of peace that settles deep into your bones, the kind of peace that allows you to stand on a balcony and breathe in the cold, clear air of your own absolute freedom, is incredibly expensive. It costs you your illusions. It costs you your comfort zone, and very often, it costs you your biological family. But the return on that investment is your soul. After that stormy afternoon, I never spoke to Julian or Beatrice again. I heard through the hollow, echoing grapevine of distant relatives that Julian eventually had to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy and move into a cramped studio apartment, forced to actually work a grueling entry-level sales job just to survive. Beatrice's husband finally grew a spine and divorced her, leaving her to navigate the ashes of her social life without a dime to her name. They became exactly what they always were beneath the designer labels. Nothing. Without their constant, suffocating negativity draining my energy, my empire continued to expand. Obsidian Holdings doubled in size over the next 3 years. But more importantly than the billions of dollars in my accounts, I was finally able to grieve David properly. I built a beautiful, quiet life in the sanctuary we designed together. I filled the house with art, with dogs, with loyal, chosen friends who loved me for my mind and my spirit, not for what I could buy them. I built a family of choice, which is always, always stronger than a family of chance. I was no longer the pathetic little sister in the black dress. I was the CEO of my own existence. And you can be too. You hold the absolute power to legally, emotionally, and financially evict toxic people from the premises of your life. You do not need their permission to be successful. You do not need their validation to know your worth. And you absolutely do not owe them an explanation when you finally decide to walk away. The disrespect was the closure. The abuse was the catalyst. Let them call you crazy. Let them tell the rest of the extended family that you are unhinged, selfish, and cold-hearted. Let them paint you as the villain in a story they completely fabricated. A tiger does not lose sleep over the opinions of sheep, and an independent, self-made titan does not care about the gossip of bankrupt parasites. As we bring this narrative to a close, I have one final, vital assignment for you. We are not just telling stories on this channel. We are building a fortress. We are assembling an army of survivors who have crawled out of the trenches of family trauma and are now standing on the mountaintop. I need you to go down into the comments section right now. I want you to tell the world about the day you finally dropped the safety net. Tell me about the exact moment you looked at the Julian or Beatrice in your life and realized that you were done. How did you walk away? Did you block their numbers? Did you pack your bags in the middle of the night? Did you finally say no when they asked for money one last time? Share your triumph. Share your pain. And most importantly, share the absolute, undeniable peace you found on the other side of that boundary. Your story, your exact words, could be the final spark of courage that someone else reading the comments needs today to finally change their own life. Your survival is a beacon of light for someone currently lost in the storm. Hit that like button so the algorithm pushes this video to the millions of people who are silently suffering under the weight of weaponized family guilt. Subscribe to the channel and make sure you turn the notification bell all the way on. Every single week, we are going to tear down these societal lies, expose the toxic tactics of abusers, and teach you how to build your own ironclad empire of independence. Remember, the quietest people in the room are often the most dangerous when provoked. Never apologize for protecting your sanctuary. Never negotiate with terrorists, even if they share your last name. Stay strong. Protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.